There are moments in a man's life when the clock seems louder than usual, not because it has grown in strength, but because the soul has at last grown quiet enough to hear it. The ticking becomes a sermon. The passing seconds become witnesses, and somewhere between one breath and the next, a voice, gentle yet unyielding, whispers what we have long tried to avoid. Those who skip me will never enter heaven. We live in an age remarkably skilled at skipping. We skip advertisements, skip introductions, skip lines, skip discomfort, skip responsibility, and most tragically, we skip God. We treat him as though he were an optional chapter in a book we believe we already understand. We imagine heaven as a destination one might stumble into by accident, as if eternity were some public park whose gates swing open for anyone who happens to wander near. Yet heaven is not a place one drifts toward. It is not the final stop of a moral commuter train. It is the home of a king, and no one enters the home of a king by pretending the king does not exist. To skip God is not merely to miss a Sunday or neglect a prayer. It is to structure one's life in such a way that he becomes unnecessary. It is to nod politely at the idea of him while arranging every decision as though we ourselves were sovereign. It is to enjoy his gifts while ignoring his presence. And there is something profoundly dishonest about wanting the warmth of the sun while denying the existence of the sun itself. Heaven, if it is anything at all, must be the place where God is fully known and fully loved. It cannot be a refuge for those who spent their earthly days perfecting the art of avoidance. Imagine inviting a man to a grand feast in honor of a beloved father, only to discover that the guest has no interest in the father whatsoever. He merely heard there would be food. Would such a man find joy at the table? Or would he find himself restless, alien, irritated by the very object of celebration? We often think of heaven as reward, but it is more accurately reunion. It is the final unveiling of the one whom the heart was made for. And if a man has trained his heart to beat in indifference toward God, heaven would not feel like home. It would feel like intrusion. There is a strange habit in modern spirituality. We wish to inherit promises without embracing the promiser. We speak of blessings as though they were detached commodities, like coins to be collected, rather than expressions of a relationship. But blessings are not souvenirs. They are signs pointing back to the giver. To desire heaven while skipping God is to desire the crown while scorning the king. The phrase, "open before 11:59 p.m., carries with it an urgency that unsettles us. It suggests a deadline, a boundary, a moment beyond which the opportunity no longer stands. We recoil at the idea. We prefer to think that doors remain forever ajar, that we may approach them at our leisure. But every meaningful decision in life is bound by time. The exam ends, the train departs, the heart beats a finite number of times. It is not cruelty that gives a door a closing hour. It is reality. The tragedy is not that God would refuse entrance to those who skip him. The tragedy is that many will have refused him long before any gate is reached. Heaven does not begin at death. It begins wherever God is welcomed. Likewise, separation does not begin in the grave. It begins in the quiet dismissal of his voice today. We must ask ourselves an uncomfortable question. If God were removed from our ambitions, our relationships, our daily routines, how much would truly change? If the answer is very little, then we have already practiced skipping him, and habits formed in time often solidify in eternity. Yet the warning is not merely a threat. It is an invitation, wrapped in seriousness. A father who sees his child wandering toward a cliff does not whisper suggestions. He shouts, not because he delights in fear, but because he delights in the child. The firmness of the message reveals the depth of the love behind it. "Those who skip me will never enter heaven" is not the voice of exclusion. It is the voice of longing. It is God saying, in effect, "Do not train yourself to live without me, for heaven is life with me." It is a plea to stop treating the eternal as though he were expendable. There is still time measured not merely by clocks, but by willingness, to open the heart before the day ends, before indifference calcifies into resistance, to stop skipping the quiet nudge to pray, the gentle conviction to repent, the subtle reminder to forgive, to choose, deliberately and without delay, to make room for the one who made room for us in existence itself. For heaven is not entered by accident. It is entered by desire shaped over years, by love practiced in ordinary days, by a life that refuses to skip the very source of life. And the clock, whether we hear it or not, continues its steady sermon, urging us to decide while the door still stands open. There is something deeply revealing about the modern instinct to skip. We skip what does not immediately gratify us. We skip what challenges us. We skip what seems too demanding, too slow, too quiet. And in doing so, we slowly train our hearts to avoid depth altogether. When this habit seeps into the spiritual life, it becomes far more dangerous than we first imagine. For to skip God is not simply to overlook a religious activity. It is to condition the soul to live as though its very source were optional. Most people do not reject God with clenched fists and loud declarations. They simply postpone him. They mean to return later, to consider him when life becomes less busy, less noisy, less demanding. They assure themselves that faith is a chapter they will read when they have finished writing the chapters that seem more urgent. But the tragedy is that the heart does not remain neutral during postponement. It is always being shaped, and every day that God is treated as unnecessary, the soul becomes slightly more comfortable without him. We must understand that heaven is not a reward handed out for occasional acknowledgement. It is the natural environment of those who have grown accustomed to God's presence. If a man has spent his life skipping the very idea of God, skipping prayer, skipping reflection, skipping obedience, why would he suddenly feel at home in a reality where God is the central and unavoidable fact? Heaven would not feel like fulfillment. It would feel like exposure. Consider how relationships work in our ordinary lives. No friendship deepens by neglect. No love strengthens through indifference. If you consistently ignore someone, dismiss their invitations, and avoid their voice, you cannot reasonably expect intimacy at the end of it. Yet many imagine that they can skip God throughout their earthly existence and somehow enter eternal closeness without having desired it beforehand. It is a contradiction we rarely pause to examine. To skip God is also to misunderstand the nature of joy. We often treat joy as something detachable from its source. We want peace without surrender, purpose without obedience, blessings without reverence. But God is not a vending machine of spiritual benefits. He is not a concept to be consulted in crisis and dismissed in comfort. He is the very ground of being, the breath behind our breath. When we skip him, we do not merely lose religious structure, we distance ourselves from the fountain of life itself. There is also a subtler form of skipping that is even more deceptive. It is possible to speak of God often and yet avoid him personally. One can discuss theology, share verses, attend gatherings, and still keep the heart carefully guarded from true surrender. This kind of skipping is more refined, more socially acceptable. It allows us to appear devout while remaining untouched. But heaven is not entered through appearance. It is entered through alignment of the will. When God says that those who skip him will never enter heaven, the statement is no. Rooted in arbitrary exclusion. It is rooted in coherence. Heaven is the realm where God is fully embraced. If a person has consistently chosen autonomy over relationship, self-rule over divine guidance, then the direction of their soul has already been set. God does not force intimacy upon those who have persistently declined it. Love cannot be compelled without ceasing to be love. Time plays a crucial role in this matter. Every day presents small opportunities to acknowledge or ignore God. These moments seem insignificant in isolation. A nudge to pray, a conviction to apologize, a prompting to forgive, a reminder to give thanks. Yet each decision forms a thread, and threads woven together become the fabric of character. Skipping God in small moments may feel harmless, but over years it constructs a life in which he occupies no meaningful space. We must also confront our assumption that we control the timing of spiritual seriousness. Many intend to turn fully toward God someday, but the heart does not respond to command as easily as we assume. Habits solidify. Desires calcify. What we repeatedly ignore eventually grows faint. The voice we once heard clearly becomes distant, not because it stopped speaking, but because we trained ourselves not to listen. There is mercy in the warning. A warning implies that change is still possible. It signals that the door has not yet closed. But mercy should not be mistaken for endless delay. The opportunity to seek God exists within the boundaries of time, and time is a fragile gift. The seriousness of the message is itself an expression of care. If heaven is life with God, then entering it begins not at death, but now. It begins in the refusal to skip him today. It begins in the humble admission that we are not self-sustaining, that our independence is partial and borrowed. It begins when we choose presence over postponement, reverence over distraction, surrender over self-sufficiency. To skip God is to practice eternity without him. To seek him is to rehearse the very life we claim to desire. And the difference between those two paths is not merely theological, it is profoundly personal. Every hour quietly asks which direction we are choosing. There is a persistent illusion that heaven is primarily about location rather than condition. We imagine it as a distant realm, separated from us by death alone, as though the only barrier between ourselves and eternal joy is the final breath. But heaven is not merely a change of address. It is a transformation of appetite. It is the fulfillment of a longing that must first be awakened. And here lies the difficulty. A soul that has trained itself to desire everything but God will not suddenly discover delight in him simply because time has run out. To say that those who skip God will never enter heaven is to confront the nature of desire itself. Heaven is not a prize distributed to the morally decent. It is communion with the divine. It is not merely freedom from pain, but immersion in holiness. If a person has spent years resisting holiness, avoiding conviction, resisting surrender, dismissing truth, then heaven would not feel like comfort but confrontation. The very light that brings joy to one heart may feel unbearable to another that has grown accustomed to shadow. We often underestimate how deeply our choices shape our capacities. Each act of dismissal weakens the muscle of attention. Each moment of indifference thickens the wall around the heart. The soul, like the body, adapts to its habits. If we feed it constant distraction, it becomes restless in silence. If we feed it pride, it becomes allergic to humility. And if we feed it self-rule, it grows suspicious of any authority higher than its own impulses. Thus, when the invitation to heaven is extended, it is not simply a matter of permission, but of preference. What have we trained ourselves to love? There is something profoundly sobering in realizing that God does not bar the gates of heaven arbitrarily. Rather, people bar themselves through sustained refusal. Divine judgment is not a sudden invention at the end of life. It is the unveiling of a direction chosen repeatedly over time. If a person insists on life without God, God may ultimately grant that wish. The tragedy is that existence without the source of goodness is not liberation, but emptiness. Consider how often we say we want peace while fiercely guarding our resentment. We claim to want truth while avoiding self-examination. We speak of eternity while clinging desperately to temporary pleasures. This divided heart cannot flourish in heaven, because heaven is the realm of undivided devotion. It is the place where love is whole, where allegiance is clear, where God is not an accessory, but the center. Some resist this idea because it feels exclusive. Yet every meaningful relationship carries exclusivity. Marriage, friendship, loyalty, these require a turning toward one and away from another. To enter heaven is to turn decisively toward God. It is to say that his will is not an intrusion but a delight. If we have spent our earthly years insisting that our will remain supreme, then heaven would represent not fulfillment, but surrender of the very autonomy we protected. There is also a misconception that last-minute acknowledgement can substitute for lifelong orientation. While grace is abundant, grace is not a loophole for indifference. A heart that genuinely turns to God, even at the final hour, does so because something within it has awakened to desire Him. But a heart that merely fears consequence without loving the one it once ignored has not yet understood what heaven truly is. Entrance into Eta. Null life is not secured by panic, it is shaped by love. We must reckon with the fact that God respects human freedom to a terrifying degree. He does not force affection, He does not coerce worship. He invites, calls, warns, and waits. But if a person continually skips Him, skips prayer, skips obedience, skips repentance, then they are actively choosing distance. Over time, distance becomes destiny. Heaven is the culmination of a relationship begun in time. It is not the sudden creation of a bond that never existed. If we have avoided God in ordinary moments, pushing aside conviction, ignoring gratitude, refusing surrender, then we should not be surprised if our hearts find no resonance with His presence later. Eternity simply amplifies what time has established. This truth is not meant to instill despair, but clarity. It reveals that the stakes of daily choices are higher than they appear. Each act of turning toward God strengthens our capacity for heaven. Each act of skipping Him weakens it. We are not drifting aimlessly, we are becoming something. The question is not merely whether heaven exists, but whether we are becoming the kind of people who would rejoice there. God's declaration is not a rejection, but a revelation. It uncovers the profound link between desire and destiny. Those who skip Him are not denied heaven against their will. They have spent their lives cultivating a will that does not want Him. And heaven, stripped of God, would not be heaven at all. Therefore, the matter presses upon us now, not in grand gestures alone, but in quiet decisions. Will we pause to acknowledge Him? Will we allow His truth to reshape us? Will we seek Him not as a means to an end, but as the end itself? For in choosing Him, we are not merely securing a future location. We are beginning a life that can flourish in His presence forever. There is an urgency woven into the human story that we are often reluctant to acknowledge. We live as though time were an endless field stretching far beyond the horizon, yet deep within, we sense that it is more like a narrowing path. The phrase, "open before 11:59 p.m., unsettles us not because of its poetry, but because of its precision. It suggests that opportunity has edges. It implies that mercy, while abundant, operates within the framework of time. And this is the truth we most resist, that the door does not remain open indefinitely. We prefer to think of spiritual decisions as elastic, capable of being stretched to suit our convenience. We tell ourselves that we will seek God more earnestly when life becomes less chaotic, when responsibilities lessen, when wounds heal, when questions resolve. But life has a way of multiplying its demands rather than reducing them. Tomorrow rarely offers more stillness than today. And so the decision is postponed, not once, but repeatedly, until postponement becomes a pattern. Time is not merely the background of our lives. It is the arena in which our souls are shaped. Every day is a quiet rehearsal for eternity. Each hour either inclines us toward God or gently away from Him. We imagine that neutrality is possible, that we can simply drift without consequence. Yet drift itself has direction. A boat untethered does not remain stationary. It is carried by currents unseen. So too the human heart, if not intentionally anchored in God, is carried by distraction, ambition, resentment, and pride. The warning about a closing hour is not meant to produce panic, but awareness. There is something sobering about a deadline because it forces clarity. When we know a door will close, we evaluate our priorities differently. What once seemed trivial becomes urgent. What once felt optional becomes essential. In the spiritual sense, the awareness that our time is finite should awaken us to the seriousness of skipping God. To skip Him today, because we assume we will have tomorrow, is to gamble with a resource we do not control. No one possesses a contract guaranteeing another sunrise. The fragility of life is not a dramatic exaggeration. It is a daily reality. And yet we build our spiritual habits on the assumption of endless tomorrows. We speak casually about someday as though it were a destination already secured. But the soul does not remain unaffected by delay. Each postponed response to God slightly dulls the edge of conviction. The first time we ignore His prompting, we feel a twinge. The second time, the discomfort lessens. By the 10th time, silence feels normal. The heart adapts to absence with alarming ease. What once felt urgent becomes background noise. Thus, the closing of the door is not merely an external event at the end of life. It is an internal process that unfolds gradually. There is also a profound kindness in God's urgency. A parent who tells a child to come inside before nightfall is not restricting joy, but protecting life. The boundary is an expression of care. In the same way, the call to turn to God before the hour grows late is not divine impatience, but divine compassion. It recognizes that the longer we remain distant, the harder it becomes to return. We must also consider that eternity is not simply a continuation of our present state. It is the unveiling of it. What we are becoming now is what we will carry forward. If we have cultivated indifference toward God, that indifference does not evaporate at death. If we have nurtured pride, resentment, or self-sufficiency, these traits do not dissolve automatically. The closing hour reveals rather than transforms. The phrase, before 11:59 p.m., symbolizes the final moment of opportunity. But in truth, every minute before that carries its O. One significance, the call is not merely to avoid being too late, but to avoid wasting the present. There is richness available now in communion with God. Peace that steadies the anxious heart, wisdom that clarifies confusion, purpose that transcends circumstance. Skipping Him does not merely jeopardize the future, it impoverishes the present. We often fear that turning fully toward God will cost us freedom, yet what we call freedom frequently resembles captivity to impulse. True freedom is found not in autonomy without limits, but in alignment with the One who designed our nature. To respond before the hour grows late is to step into that alignment while there is still time to deepen it. The seriousness of the deadline should not produce despair, but decision. It is a reminder that life is not an endless rehearsal. It is the performance itself. The door stands open now, not because it must, but because mercy has willed it so. But mercy does not negate responsibility. It invites response. Each passing moment quietly asks whether we will continue skipping God, or finally seek Him with intention. The clock does not shout, it ticks. Yet within that steady rhythm lies a profound truth. Opportunity is precious because it is temporary. And the wise heart does not wait for the final second to discover what it should have valued all along. There is a dangerous assumption buried deep within the human heart, the belief that we can construct a meaningful life while keeping God at a comfortable distance. We imagine that morality, ambition, kindness, and even spirituality can flourish independently, as though the Creator were an optional accessory rather than the foundation itself. Yet when we attempt to build without Him, we discover that what appears stable on the surface often conceals cracks beneath. To skip God is not always dramatic. It is rarely a loud declaration of rebel. Ion. More often, it is a quiet rearrangement of priorities. We give Him a polite corner of our lives rather than the center. We consult Him in crisis, but ignore Him in comfort. We allow Him to influence our words, but not our desires, our rituals, but not our ambitions. In this subtle displacement, we convince ourselves that we have not rejected him. We have merely adjusted his role, but God does not compete for supporting positions. He is not content to be an ornament in the architecture of our plans. If he is truly God, then he is either central or absent. The human heart may attempt compromise, but heaven does not operate on compromise. It operates on alignment. When God declares that those who skip him will never enter heaven, he is revealing a truth about the nature of reality. Heaven is not a realm where divided loyalties can thrive. It is the full expression of God's presence. It is the place where love for him is not partial, distracted, or reluctant. If we spend our earthly lives cultivating divided affection, clinging to self-rule while occasionally acknowledging divine authority, we are shaping a heart unprepared for such a place. There is a profound connection between worship and transformation. What we consistently revere, we gradually resemble. If we worship success, we become consumed by achievement. If we worship approval, we become enslaved to opinion. And if we worship ourselves, we become fragile, defensive, and perpetually dissatisfied. But if we worship God, truly orienting our lives around him, we begin to reflect his character. Humility softens us. Mercy steadies us. Truth clarifies us. Skipping God interrupts this transformation. It halts the shaping process that prepares the soul for eternity. We may still develop talents, accumulate possessions, and earn admiration, but these achievements do not substitute for spiritual formation. Heaven is not impressed by resumes. It welcomes hearts that have learned to love what God loves. There is also the matter of authority. Many resist surrender because it feels like diminishment. We equate submission with weakness, as though acknowledging God's authority reduces our worth. Yet the opposite is true. To recognize God as sovereign is to step into the order of reality. It is to acknowledge that we are creatures, not creators, dependent, not self-sustaining. This recognition does not belittle us. It liberates us from the exhausting burden of pretending to be ultimate. When we skip God, we assume a weight we were never designed to carry. We become the final judges of right and wrong, the architects of meaning, the guarantors of our own destiny. Such autonomy may feel empowering at first, but it inevitably breeds anxiety. Without a higher anchor, everything becomes uncertain. Without a transcendent reference point, even morality bends under pressure. Heaven, by contrast, is the place where God's authority is not resented, but celebrated. It is the fulfillment of rightful order. To enter such a reality requires more than intellectual agreement. It requires heartfelt surrender. And surrender cannot be improvised at the last moment. If it has been consistently resisted, there is a subtle mercy in recognizing this now. The realization that skipping God shapes our destiny is not meant to crush us, but to awaken us. Every day presents opportunities to reorder our loves. We can choose to seek his will before our own. We can choose obedience when it costs us comfort. We can choose trust when circumstances tempt us toward fear. These choices, repeated over time, form a character aligned with heaven. It is also worth noting that God's desire is not merely to grant entrance, but to cultivate relationship. He does not issue commands from a distance. He invites intimacy. The tragedy of skipping him is not only the loss of future hope, but the forfeiture of present fellowship. To live without God is to live without the fullness of what we were made for. We must abandon the illusion that neutrality exists. To delay wholehearted devotion is itself a decision. To keep God peripheral is to declare that he is unnecessary, and if we persist in that declaration, eternity will simply confirm it. The call, then, is not to religious performance, but to realignment. Not to outward display, but inward surrender. To place God not at the edge of our plans, but at their beginning. For heaven is not a realm where God is tolerated. It is the realm where he is treasured. and only those who have learned to treasure him now will find themselves at home there. There remains one final and piercing truth beneath all the warnings, all the urgency, and all the solemn declarations. God is not seeking to keep people out of heaven. He is seeking to draw them in. The statement that those who skip him will never enter is not a celebration of exclusion, but a lament over separation. It is the grief of a father whose children wander, the ache of a creator whose creatures prefer his gifts to his presence. We often imagine God's justice as cold and administrative, as though heaven were guarded by an impersonal gatekeeper checking credentials. But the deeper reality is relational. The issue is not paperwork, it is partnership. Heaven is eternal fellowship with the living God. And fellowship cannot exist where there has been consistent refusal. There is something profoundly revealing about the way human beings respond to invitations when invited into intimacy, whether friendship, marriage, or trust. We either lean in or hold back. Repeated hesitation communicates something. Silence, when sustained long enough, becomes an answer. In the same way, skipping God over the course of a lifetime is not a neutral act. It is a response. It says quietly but clearly, "Not now, perhaps later. I prefer my own way." The heart becomes shaped around autonomy. It begins to interpret surrender as threat rather than safety. It views divine authority as restriction rather than rescue. And thus, when the final invitation stands before it in full clarity, it may find itself strangely resistant to the very presence that defines heaven. Yet even here, mercy persists. The warning itself is evidence of divine desire. God does not conceal the stakes. He does not obscure the consequences. He speaks plainly because love speaks plainly when eternity is involved. A vague caution would be easier to ignore, but clarity disrupts complacency. Clarity forces decision. We must confront the illusion that we can indefinitely balance devotion and neglect. Many attempt to maintain a thin thread of acknowledgement, just enough religion to quiet the conscience, just enough faith to ease fear, while continuing to skip genuine surrender. But partial allegiance cannot sustain eternal communion. Heaven is not built upon fragments of attention. It is built upon wholehearted love. There is also a deep misunderstanding about freedom at the heart of our resistance. We fear that choosing God fully will shrink our lives, limit our pleasures, narrow our options. Yet the paradox is that life expands in proportion to its alignment with its purpose. A fish is most free in water, not on land. A bird is most free in the air, not underwater. In the same way, the human soul is most alive in communion with God. Skipping him does not enlarge us, it disorients us. The habits we cultivate now are rehearsals for eternity. If we regularly silence conviction, we rehearse separation. If we nurture gratitude, we rehearse worship. If we practice humility, we rehearse belonging. Heaven is not foreign to the heart that seeks God daily. It is the natural continuation of a relationship already cherished. The urgency of before 11:59 p.m. is not about fear-driven religion. It is about recognition that time is the soil in which eternal character grows. Once the soil is gone, growth ceases. What has been planted remains. The direction chosen solidifies. The door that once invited becomes the door that confirms. But while the clock still moves, transformation remains possible. The most hardened pattern can begin to soften. The most distracted heart can awaken. The one who has skipped God repeatedly can choose, even now, to pause and turn. And that turn, however small it feels, is not insignificant. It is the beginning of alignment. God does not demand perfection before relationship. He seeks willingness. He does not require flawless understanding. He desires open hearts. The tragedy is not that people are too broken for heaven. The tragedy is that many are too proud, too distracted, or too comfortable to seek the one who heals. Skipping God is ultimately a matter of misplaced trust. We trust our plans more than his wisdom. We trust our desires more than his design. We trust our timing more than his urgency. But every misplaced trust eventually reveals its instability. And when it does, we are faced with the question we have long postponed. Will we continue building without him? Or will we surrender the foundation itself? The declaration stands not as a threat echoing in emptiness, but as a call resonating with longing. Those who skip him will not enter heaven, not because heaven is barred by cruelty, but because heaven is the fullness of the very relationship they have declined. The invitation remains, but it requires response. The door stands open, but it must be entered intentionally. And while time still grants its fragile gift, the choice remains alive, pressing gently yet persistently upon the heart.